June 23, 1941. The outskirts of Grodno, Byelorussian SSR. The morning air is thick, saturated with the metallic tang of diesel exhaust and the humid breath of the Belarusian forest. Private Hans Werner of the 37th Anti-Tank Battalion wipes a layer of grit from his forehead, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusts the traverse gear on his 37mm PAK-36. To his comrades, the war has been a parade, a rapid, mechanized surge across Europe. But today, the parade has stopped. Somewhere in the dense tree line ahead, a sound emerges that does not belong to the Wehrmacht's tactical manuals. It is a deep, guttural growl, a heavy, rhythmic churning of steel tracks against earth, vibrating through the soles of Hans's boots. It is not the high-pitched clatter of a Panzer. It is something else, something angry. "Target!" His commander screams, his voice cracking. "Left, 300 meters. Hans peers through the optic. A shape emerges from the mist, low-slung, prow-like, and impossibly angular. It looks like a predatory shark made of cold, riveted steel. He squeezes the firing lever. The PAK-36 spits a 37mm armor-piercing round. A perfect strike, center mass, against the hull. Hans waits for the explosion, for the turret to fly, for the smoke to billow. Nothing. The shell, the very same shell that had humbled the French and the Poles, simply spat sparks and skittered off the tank's side. The T-34 didn't even shudder. It didn't pause. It merely rolled forward, indifferent to the futile sting of the German gun. Another round, another ricochet. The tank's main cannon, a long, menacing tube, swivels toward their position with terrifying hydraulic precision. Panic, on cold and sharp, cuts through the humid air. They are not fighting a machine. They are fighting a brick wall that moves at 30 miles per hour. This was the T-34 shock. For the German infantry, the arrival of the T-34 was the moment the myth of their own invincibility began to dissolve. They had been taught that Soviet equipment was primitive, produced by a backwards agrarian society incapable of matching the technical genius of the Reich. What they saw before them was a masterclass in geometry. The designers, led by Mikhail Koshkin, had ignored the prevailing wisdom of the era, that to be strong, a tank must be thick and vertical, like a fortress wall. Instead, they had looked to the laws of physics. By angling the steel plates, what historians now call sloped armor, the Soviets had performed a miracle of defensive engineering. A 45mm plate of steel, if tilted at an angle, effectively presents a much greater thickness to an incoming projectile. The physics are simple, but brutal. An incoming shell is more likely to glance off the angled surface than to penetrate it. As the T-34s rumbled through the German lines, the crew members inside, often tired, terrified, and operating in a cramped, smoke-filled inferno, hardly realized they were changing the course of history. They were not fighting for glory or ideological superiority in that moment. They were fighting with a machine that asked very little of its crew, but gave everything in return. It was a brutal, elegant pragmatism. While the German tanks of 1941 were intricate, complicated jewelry boxes of engineering that broke down under the stress of the Russian summer, the T-34 was a sledgehammer. It was rugged. It was simple. And as Hans Werner realized, watching his squad scatter in the face of the encroaching hull, it was lethal. The war had just shifted from a blitzkrieg of maneuver into a war of attrition, and the Soviets had just revealed the weapon that would eventually grind the Wehrmacht into the dust of the Eastern Front. October 14th, 1941. Factory number 183, Kharkov. The air inside the massive assembly hall is a suffocating mixture of ozone, metallic dust, and desperation. Outside, the distant, rhythmic thud of German artillery provides a grim soundtrack to the chaos. The Wehrmacht is closing in, and the order from Moscow is absolute. Evacuate. Nikolai, a foreman with hands stained black by industrial grease, watches as massive overhead cranes tear heavy lathes and stamping presses from their concrete moorings. This is not a retreat. It is a migration of an entire civilization's industrial heart. Within days, these machines, and the thousands of workers who operate them, will be loaded onto flat cars and hauled thousands of miles east, beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe, to the shadow of the Ural Mountains. Now, while the German industry prides itself on the Meister system, highly skilled craftsmen hand-fitting precision parts into the exquisite Tiger and Panther tanks, the Soviet Union has embraced a different, more ruthless philosophy. The T-34 is being stripped of its soul to save its body. Do we need the radio? A young apprentice asks, pointing to a vacant spot in the hull. No, Nikolai grunts, gesturing to the assembly line. Only the commander's tank gets one. Give them a flag. We need tanks, not orchestras. This is the birth of Soviet pragmatism. Every non-essential component is purged. Interior paint, optional. Polished welds, a waste of time. The focus is narrowed to a singular, lethal point: armor, engine, gun. The T-34 is designed to be built by anyone. By the women and teenagers who have replaced the men gone to the front, working 14-hour shifts in unheated factories where the temperature drops so low, their skin freezes to the steel hulls. By the time the machinery is bolted down in the new Tankograd complex in Chelyabinsk, the T-34 has become a triumph of mass production. The V2 diesel engine, a masterpiece of aluminum casting, is designed with wide tolerances. It doesn't need the high-octane fuel that the German Panzers crave. It runs on heavy, crude diesel, a fuel that is less likely to turn the tank into a funeral pyre when hit. In the winter of 1942, as the snow begins to bury the Volga, the true genius of the T-34's mobility is revealed. The German commanders watch in horror through their binoculars as their Panzer IIIs and IVs sink to their bellies in the Russian Rasputitsa, the sea of mud and deep snow. Their narrow tracks, designed for the paved roads of Western Europe, are useless here. But the T-34, it floats. Its tracks are wide, spreading the 30-ton weight of the machine across the surface like a snowshoe. It traverses terrain that the Germans deemed impassable, appearing behind their flanks like a ghost of the steppe. It is a machine born of the land it defends, rugged, unforgiving, and capable of enduring conditions that would shatter more sophisticated technology. Back in the Urals, Nikolai watches the 100th tank of the week roll off the line. It is unpainted, the weld beads are ugly and raw, and the engine smokes like a chimney. But as it clatters onto the rail car, headed for the gates of Stalingrad, he knows a fundamental truth that the high command in Berlin has yet to grasp. A perfect tank that takes 8 months to build is worthless against 10 good-enough tanks that can be built in 1. The T-34 is not just a weapon. It is an industrial tide, and it is starting to rise. July 12th, 1943. The Prokhorovka grain fields, south of Kursk. The sun is a pale, sickly disk, obscured by a gargantuan shroud of dust and oily black smoke. Major Vasiliev clenches the control levers of his T-34/76. His vision tunneled through the narrow vision slit. The heat inside the steel cabin is transcendent, over 40 degrees Celsius, and the air is thick with the acrid stench of burnt powder and sweat. Through the haze, the nightmare takes shape. The Tiger One. It is a square, gray monster, mounting the dreaded 88mm gun. Vasilyev sees a T-34 to his left erupt in a geyser of orange flame. The German Cat has picked it off from 2 kilometers away. The German tanks are snipers, technical marvels capable of killing from a distance, where the T-34's 76mm gun is mere dead weight. Full speed. Vasilyev bellows over the roar of the V2 engine. They close the distance. Do not let them breathe. This is the grim calculus of the T-34 commander. To win, they must charge. They must turn a long-range duel into a knife fight in a telephone booth. Hundreds of T-34s swarm across the steppe, their wide tracks kicking up a dust storm that blinds the German optics. They are like wolves harrying a grizzly bear. At point-blank range, the T-34's limitations fade, and its pragmatism shines. Vasilyev's driver swerves, flanking a Tiger that is struggling to rotate its heavy, slow turret. At 50 meters, Vasilyev fires. The shell slams into the Tiger's vertical side armor. The shockwave rattles his own teeth. The German giant stutters, a lick of fire dancing from its engine deck. The battle is no longer about tactics. It is a mechanical meat grinder. Steel grinds against steel as tanks, as blinded and broken, literally ram one another. The T-34s are being destroyed in terrifying numbers. But for every one that burns, 2 more seem to emerge from the smoke. By sunset, the field is a graveyard of scorched metal. The German offensive, Operation Citadel, has lost its momentum. The superior German engineering has been blunted by the sheer, stubborn volume of Soviet industrial output. However, the Red Army realizes the 76mm gun is no longer enough. The T-34 must evolve or die. Even as the smoke clears from Prokhorovka, the designers are already upgunning the legend. The result is the T-34/85, a larger turret, a more powerful cannon, and a 3rd crew member in the turret to relieve the commander of the burden of loading the gun. The T-34/85 is the final form of the Predator. It retains the mobility and the sloped armor of its predecessor, but now carries a sting that can pierce the heart of the Panzerwaffe from a distance. The hunter has become the hunted. As the Soviet counteroffensive begins to roll westward, the T-34 is no longer just defending the motherland. It is a herald of the coming storm, a steel tide that will not stop until it reaches the charred gates of the Reichstag. April 16, 1945. The Seelow Heights, 60 kilometers east of Berlin. The ground trembles not from an earthquake, but from the synchronized ignition of thousands of V2 engines. Sergeant Mikhailov sits atop his T-34/85, his face blackened by soot and his ears ringing from the opening barrage of 143 searchlights intended to blind the German defenders. The steel legend has traveled over 2,000 kilometers from the ruins of Stalingrad to the threshold of the Third Reich. The tank beneath him is a T-34/85, the refined apex of Soviet pragmatism. It is no longer the crude, unpainted box of 1941. The 85mm gun, adapted from an anti-aircraft design, gives the Soviet crews the confidence to engage the heaviest German armor on equal terms. But more importantly, the T-34/85 represents the ultimate victory of the Soviet assembly line, whereas the order "Vperod," forward, crackles over the radio, now a standard feature in every tank. Mikhailov's driver slams the heavy gear lever. The tank lunges forward, its wide tracks biting into the soft, shell-torn earth of the Oder River Valley. To their left and right, as far as the eye can see, is a forest of steel. The Germans have dug in with desperate ferocity, wielding the Panzer, disposable handheld anti-tank weapons that can turn a T-34 into a furnace in seconds. In the narrow, rubble-choked streets of the Berlin suburbs, the T-34's mobility is neutralized. Mikhailov watches as the lead tank in his platoon is hit, its turret lifting off the hull on a pillar of white-hot flame. "Infantry, cover the flanks!" Mikhailov screams. This is the final test of the T-34's design. In these urban canyons, the tank becomes a brutal battering ram. When a barricade blocks the street, the T-34 doesn't maneuver. It drives through the walls of the buildings themselves. When a sniper's nest holds up the Red Army's advance, the 85mm gun levels the entire floor. The T-34's legacy was never about being invincible. It was about being persistent. For every T-34 knocked out in the Tiergarten or near the Brandenburg Gate, 3 more rolled over its smoldering remains. The German defense, characterized by the over-engineered, fuel-hungry King Tigers, eventually starved to death. The T-34, fueled by the inexhaustible industrial output of the Urals and the sheer willpower of crews like Mikhailov's, simply outlasted them. By May 2nd, the T-34s are parked in the shadow of the Reichstag. Their engines are switched off, and for the first time in 4 years, there is a deafening silence. The tanks are scarred, their paint is blistered, and their hulls are pitted with the marks of 1,000 ricochets. They are the physical manifestation of a nation that refused to break. The T-34 started the war as a shock to the system and ended it as the architect of a new world order. It proved that in the crucible of total war, the most sophisticated machine is not the one with the tightest tolerances or the most complex optics. It is the one that can be built by the tens of thousands, repaired in the mud, and driven by the common soldier all the way to the heart of the enemy.